Imagine our organization, like any other business out there, is going through some changes. Maybe we're buying different domains, maybe we're buying subdomains, maybe there's different sales functions that are required, or maybe we're buying new applications and their functionalities and features. Well, how do we secure our digital certificates throughout the environment? What are the different types that are available to us? What are the different forms of validations? And finally, can you walk through a couple of digital certificate scenarios and how they secure our environment? Well, I'm glad you asked. In this video, we're going to cover the three different areas around that. So we're going to look at the different types, we're going to look at the different forms of validation, and finally, we'll do a scenario walkthrough with two examples. So let's just say that our organization is growing like any other organization. And typically, the different types of digital certificates that are available to us, well, there's three different ones that are available. We've got wildcards, we have extended validations, say VAL for short, and then we have multi-domain, right? And let's just say that we own a domain. So we own xyz domain.com.au. And let's just say that, for example, our business is growing, right? We've got different portals and functions and different sales teams. Or maybe we're growing a marketing team. Or now we've got an underwriting component. Maybe we're now, utilizing a new platform of such. And we've got to go away and buy different subdomains. So we may have to buy maybe a gateway at, our organization, which is this. We may have to buy webmail. We may have to buy a specific portal page. We may have to buy a marketing page. May have to buy maybe a sales platform or a sales enabled page. So you can start to see the scale in which the subdomains start to grow. Well, do we or are we required to buy new certificates every single time we do this? Or not necessarily, right? So the very first component when we start talking about different types, well, we have wildcards that are available to us. And wildcards are basically an asterisk like form, right? So they get issued and then we can use them across all our subdomains. So they'll be valid across all our subdomains. So think of this in the form of helping us with load balancing or helping us with accelerating security between the multiple and different sites and obviously the location of our domain names. Just so you can understand the context of this, think of it in forms of our passports or our driver's license, right? The important or the most important thing with these documents are typically who issued them. Now, I live in Sydney, so we have our New South Wales Authority, the New South Wales driver's license here, and anytime we present these, right, it comes with a form of, well, who issued these documents, and then the person that holds it, in this case, let's say it's me, well, I identify its legitimacy, so I prove that yes, it's legitimate, and then I may have a certain association of status assigned with it. Maybe I can enter certain maybe geographical locations if I house maybe a very specific passport, for example. Maybe I have a security clearance assigned to that, and then I can get enabled into certain areas. So digital certificates kind of work in the same manner, right? So we can talk about our documents like that. And then the same is true for our digital certificates. Then when we have our extended validations and extended validations, the creme de la creme of our digital certificates. So if we go away and we purchase an SSL or a TLS certificate, those certs immediately have a form of status associated with them. So that's good. We want that. So we know at this point these certificates perform a level of trust, they have data security assigned to them. And what we mean by extended validations, well, there's various levels of validation that happen with these various certificates that we have to deal with in our environment. So extended validations, it's not always just about the trustworthiness of maybe that certificate authority that issued those certificates, but also the level of trust that is established for that particular certificate that we potentially hold in our environment. And then we've got multi-level domains, which we'll talk about as well in just a moment. So they're the three different sort of forms around the different types of certificates that are available to us. Now, in terms of validation, so the different validation forms, well, we can have organizational level validation, we can have domain level validation, and then again, we can have our extended validation. Now, extended validation, if we're just talking about that, now think of that in terms of the highest form of authentication, and typically is involved in very tight knit security environments, right? When we're dealing with maybe, um, you know, maybe we're dealing with a very specific function across that organization, high fintech, or banking, financial, e-commerce. And typically, when we're dealing with extended security validation certificates, they're more favorable opposed to maybe having an ordinary certificate. So the highly more prestigious, especially if you're comparing extended validation cert to maybe an all, just a general, not say general cert here. So the extended ones will have more weight, more value, opposed to a single one, or just the ordinary certificate in that process. So these typically as well can have additional features. So they're usually packaged with functions and features and maybe different requirements as well. Like you've got to obviously go away and prove your identity, your location of your address, your business location details, domain validation. So it's a bit more rigorous checks. Some of them also have, tied in malware assessments and vulnerability assessments, and they typically appeal or become more appealing to organizations that carry sensitive data. If we're talking about high fintech, banking, investment management, firms like that operate, in critical or confidentiality across their systems, or any business that wants to carry that confidentiality across the system. So now, if we need to secure multiple domains across the environment, well, we'd then need to have a multi-domain certificate, right? So we can't, if we hold or different domains, if we own xyz.com.au and maybe we have to own abc.com.au, well, then we will need obviously a multi-domain level certificate that can enable that to happen. Now, when we talk about wildcards, well, wildcards allow us to secure as many subdomains as we can, right? So we can have one domain and then we can have a bunch of subdomains within that organization. Wildcards are great to do that. Now, the other challenge with that is with the subdomains, well, extended validations don't operate in that manner. So we cannot use an external validation certificate to do subdomain certificate validation. So it can't happen in that manner. Now, let's talk a little bit about the different types of scenarios. So scenario one, if I just write scenario one over here, scenario one is the different types of scenarios when we're talking about dealing with digital certificates and how they secure our environment. Well, we've got client server authentication. So I'm just client server. And this is typically, all clients in our environment basically authenticate with a single server that we're either communicating with, and we have to verify that obviously that server is truly who or she says it is, right? So if that server says, "Hey, I'm a DNS web server," or "I'm a specific web server dealing with a certain traffic," then we want to prove its validity and obviously its authenticness. So any type of server, it doesn't really need to apply in large environments, or maybe specific protocols that we use in the environment. Maybe we've got a web server, or maybe another server that we need to SSH into. Well, then when we're using SSH, for example, that's quite a sensitive protocol, right? Because now we're creating, well, we need to establish unicast traffic to communicate with that server. And then the certs in that process will become very important in that process because we want to prove its validity. So apart from the server authentication, digital signatures become important because digital certs allow us to identify a couple of things right in that process. Now, if we've got two bits of communication here, and I've already spoken a little bit about the private keys and the public keys in the previous video, but just sort of a bit of a recap, and I've got Bob on this side, and maybe I've got Mary on this side. Well, then if these two are going to form a form of communication, like a client server authentication process, well, then we've got to go through the hashing of the plain text message, do the encryption of the message, the penning of the signatures as well, plus the use of public keys for the decryption, and finally being able to read that message, right? So when we're talking about the private key and the public key, got to go through that process. The other form, when we start talking about the different forms of scenarios, is signing. Now, if we're using specific applications in that process, well, then we can go away and hash those applications to give a string of value to prove its validityness, right? Or to prove it's authentic, right? So we can use a check against that application to prove its integrity, obviously, and the validity of the software. So we can run that XE across the program, obviously the application, and every time each people or the users use that software, well, then the application begins to sign and verify that software is coming from a trusted source, which is what we want. So, that's typically around hashing, and then we can publish that hash, on our website. That way, when people use the platform, well, then they can go away and obviously view the hash and then validate, yes, it is the software that we're running on that machine, and prove its trustworthiness, right? So they're the three common types of certificates. So we've spoken about wildcards. Obviously, wildcards you can use on a subdomain level, extended validations. We've got multi-level domains, and we've spoken about two different scenarios across client-server communications and signing of our application. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If there's anything else you'd love to see more around that public key infrastructure, I'd love to hear about more feedback. And as always, see you all in the next video. Bye for now.